and the rule of law. Thus, many decades later, coups were supposed to be rare or even a very, very foreign thing, a historical thing actually in conversation. Why is this having an increasing scenario and recurrency as far as ulterior and even Bodiria conversations are concerned? And then in the presence of organizations such as continental regional bodies, you do have the African Union, you do have the ECOWAS that is on tension right now, you do have SADC and other organizations on the continent that have been orchestrated, that have been designed, developed and mandated to ensure that they protect their interests and the governance over Africa moving forward. But they seem not to be doing anything, or we don't seem to see the impact of that mandate thus forth, while we are in 2023 with more coups happening, especially in the western side of Africa. The closest relation to that we can have, I think, is Sudan for us here. Our neighbors to the north of Uganda, who have also been having a similar experience, had a coup in which two generals came into power in agreement. However, they were not seeing eye to eye in returning that country to ordinary rule of law. So there lingers so many question marks. And you know what they say, if one catches a cold, or if one sneezes, somebody is going to catch a cold. Who's going to catch the cold next? And will it trickle down to Uganda eventually? All those are questions, and perhaps my pundits this morning will give us some answers. I'm joined by Honorable Simon Mulongo, security analyst, in this conversation. Good morning to you.
Good morning to you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. And of course, Mr. Alawi Semanda, who's a researcher and one whose wisdom we've been very interested in regarding international relations, part of this conversation. Good morning.
Good morning to you. Thank you very much to the viewers.
It's a pleasure. Now, let's first ask the question. It takes fuel to move a vehicle. What is fueling this vehicle of coups in Africa, especially in a time when we seem to have, quote-unquote, gained the milestone of the desired independence from our colonial masters? I'll start with you, Honorable Mulongo.
Thank you so much. I think it is various depending on this country. But of course, there is also this interconnectivity between states over certain areas like the West African one. Now, in West Africa, in the last 2-3 years, we've had quite a number of coups, close to 8. And these coups have been caused by performance of government, poor governance on the part of a number of countries. Of course, you remember we had Mali, we had the Burkina Faso, we had Guinea, Conakry, and then of course we had Chad, and then recently we've had Niger. And all these countries have common characteristics. One, they are under stress of jihadist terrorism movement across those areas except for Guinea. And then secondly, they're experiencing high level tendencies of poverty and unemployment associated with youth budge that exert a lot of demands on government. And as such, the governments have been having serious challenges of trying to manage economically. Then, of course, we have poor governance practices like corruption that have been skyrocketing in those countries. And also, we should not rule out the fact that there have been external tendencies like the French. These are all former colonies of France. And France has economic and fiscal policies that exert a lot of finance and economic costs on the former colonies. For example, anything to do with printing of currency and also hoarding of certain levels of reserves with France by those countries. And all these have a huge bearing. And then on the ground, we've had some issues of resources where the external actors tend to be exploiting resources, strategic resources, like uranium, oil, gold, and other things at the expense of the populations. So you find those countries are doing favorably well, like Europe and other Western countries that exploit and extract these resources. But the populations of these countries that are the owners of these resources are in abject poverty, miserably. And all this creates frustrations, and I think they're contributing to people to look for alternatives of how they can get rid of, call it mismanagement and corruption using military coups, and which have become very popular indeed in that area.
Okay, okay, that's very interesting. Mr. Semanda, in regards to international relations to this subject this morning, when you look at, for example, Niger being the latest one, you do have a conflict of interest within the state itself, then the coup comes up. Then you do have the regional conflict that you're looking at with ECOWAS trying to exert its pressure on the guys who have taken on the country, currently asking them to step down and restart the former President Bazoum. But also you get to look at the influence of the former colonial master, France, to whom they see they've been taking the uranium and all these other resources that they've been benefiting from without necessarily giving back to the country in terms of growth and desired development many years later of having given them quote-unquote independence. Could you draw us the relationship of all those three?
Well, first of all, what I need to start with is to make it very clear that the challenge with most of African countries, and like the other part of Global South, is that whereas many of our countries got independence, you find that we repressed the white colonialists with black colonialists. So you find that we have people who are our own, but are doing exactly what the colonialists were doing, some of them doing worse. I've had opportunity, I've taught some students from Niger, some of them I've studied with them. But when you are with them in class, you really see that they have a lot of grievances back home when they're talking about their governments. There was a time, I think it was 2019, President Macron of France visited Burkina Faso, and when he reached there, while he was talking, one student requested him, President Macron, we want electricity in our village. President of France in another country, very ridiculous. And of course, scholars and students in Burkina Faso were appalled, but to the government it sounded normal. Why? When most of African countries, especially specifically those in West Africa, when they got independence, they signed pact with France, about 11 points, very key of them. And of these pacts which they had, you find that countries like Burkina Faso, Niger, Ivory Coast, Mali, Benin, Guinea-Conakry, Guinea-Bissau, 14 of these countries, or 15, you find that they just have written independence, but they are not independent, because they have something called CFA economic zones, where you find that they have the same currency, and these countries, they have to keep 65% of their reserves in the National Bank of France. When they want to spend this money, they have to get approval from Paris. And of this money, apart from that 65%, you find that they have to commit 20% of their money if they want of their national budget, annual budget, they also have to get approval from Paris. So you find that a country can't do anything, whereas they have a local president. This local president really is algebra remote being controlled, and people really understand, they know these things. So you find that they get a bit pissed, and that of course can't get well with them, especially those ones that are paying taxes that but are not getting anything. Of these 11 points which they indicated, for example, they even told African countries, those in West Africa that were under colonial rule of France, that they have to pay for infrastructure development the colonial masters left behind. Remember, they had stolen a lot of things. Till now, they continue stealing. But again, they said you have to pay for what we left. So these things, there are very many points. For example, you cannot, if you are selling your natural resources, you have to consider France first before you sell any other buyer, even if you had higher fee which you wanted to pay. So you find that the conditions they left behind were not fair. When it comes to ECOWAS, I think ECOWAS put themselves in a very tight box. Remember, they gave an ultimatum, said you must return to civilian rule by Sunday, which passed. If you don't, we are going to intervene. ECOWAS currently is led by the president of Nigeria, and we've seen the parliament of Nigeria, Senate, trying to tell him that, look, we don't need to intervene militarily. True. Let's try to. And I think the parliament acted in a very sober way. Of course, respectfully, because, you know, Honorable, I know you'll talk about diplomacy, but you will find that even the ECOWAS leaders, most of them, they are leading vassal states that really have allegiance somewhere. Otherwise, it would be very ridiculous Africans to go and lynch each other in interest of the foreign powers. Because who is up in arms as a result of this coup? Very many of them, it's European countries, it's the Western world. I'm not saying that coups are good, but I'm saying if the citizens of the country cannot get anything from their home government, then that government should be overthrown. And that's what those people have done. So if you see countries that have intervened, I've seen France saying that we are going to offer all necessary support.
Before you continue, Mr. Semanda, let me interject you there. Why do they have to overthrow the government? Because ideally this is something that was signed and agreed many years ago, before the present government that they're trying to overthrow. I know that, of course, in some countries there's been recurrency of these coups, but I think they're not really dealing with the supposed issue at hand, which is to actually officially break away from the pen and paper of agreement that they did have with these foreign entities.
Because they see that the governments that come in, whereas they come promising, we're gonna, for example, break away, or we are going to be more independent, we are going to better conditions of people, then they continue with the old system. So that is where the problem is. And as a result, and this explains even why you are seeing some of the ECOWAS countries, it's not them speaking, those leaders. Someone is speaking behind them. They are speaking from script. For example, I've seen in Victoria Nuland, this as the acting Secretary of State for the US, she entered the country yesterday. You need to recall her in 2014 when she went to Ukraine, and at back, of course, it was leaked when she was backbiting European Union. I hope really she had very good intentions when she went to Niger. But I've not seen any African Union efforts to intervene to say that we can handle this ourselves. We don't need much foreign intervention. The regional bodies that are talking, apart from Algeria, apart from Chad, they are saying, well, I think we should explore peaceful means. We don't need to get into fighting. And of course, if you see Mali or Burkina Faso, they have to defend birds of the same feather.
Mr. Semanda, it's those peaceful negotiations got these countries into the step that they're in today because they didn't want to take their independence forcefully per se. And so they ended up in this nature of agreements that are suffocating the region as well as the African continent. We're going to be diving deeper into this conversation right after this break, but do leave your comments on our social media platforms, #morning@NTV. All right, we do continue on with the conversation, looking at the military coups that are taking center stage in Africa at a time such as this, when we thought that as an African continent we had gained our independence, our voice, and our own role to be able to then carry on the continent and have it competitive with the rest of the other continents, and perhaps someday make it a superpower for region in one way or another. However, that's not the reality. Most recent case scenario is Niger, to which it has experienced a coup in the most recent weeks, in which the president Bazoum was overtaken by a military coup. National TV, they made an address and said, we've taken over a country, and that is the military. And since then, of course, there's been interventions coming in from the US, among other superpowers and bodies. You do have the UN that has also been very vocal. You do have the regional body ECOWAS through President Tinubu that has also been very, very vocal in threatening Niger and the place that it has taken right now, that if they don't return to civilian rule, they're going to have to enforce some cohesive measures. Unfortunately, the reality in the country Niger is different. The people seem to be happy with the coup, at least from the videos and the interactions that have been given to us, the rest of the world. Within the country, the people are happy. Mr. Mulongo, that's contradictory to what we see on the outside. What is giving joy to the people in countries such as Niger that they are glad there is a military coup to save them?
I think, as I said, the conditions on the ground in terms of poverty, in terms of rampant corruption, in terms of visible exploitation and denying the citizens the ordinary livelihoods that they believe they should have had if it was the other way around, makes the change of governments that are seen to be puppets of the Western powers very exciting. So the population are very excited, and this happened in Mali, it happened in Burkina Faso, it also happened in Guinea, and also, of course, now it has even in Chad, apparently, and now in Niger. So these coups have become popular simply because people are yearning for change, and they want to see visible change, and they think they have no way of doing it other than perhaps having anybody who can do it, like the military. Not that the military may offer guarantees offering actual change that is desired, but they have hope that maybe with the change of leadership, maybe something may happen. So that may account for the reason why there is excitement and support to the military juntas in most of these Western and Sahel countries. Well,
when you say they have excitement that something could happen, that something happening is not in the power of the military. Let's be honest. It will take deliberate dialogue, negotiations, diplomacy, inclusive, which is not really in the arms of a military. And yet you see that it's military that is helping some of these countries to be able to navigate the challenges that were negotiated many years before when we had the transfer of colonial powers, returning them to the different states as the ones that we're talking about right now. So on focusing on military, it's an important institution in this discussion. It protects the state from external threats. You get to see it also playing a very fundamental role in making sure that there's any government has security, it has protection of the state. However, it also seems to be creating a danger, turning its weapons on the very regime that gives it the power of the existence is a question mark in itself. How can military personnel actually fuel civil conflicts and undermine the stability of political regimes, especially in states that lose political control on the military?
I think there are two levels here. The first level is talking about the change of regimes, and because people feel powerless and they think they cannot use their vote ordinarily to occasion the changes, and they're frustrated because each time they're voting in a new government that promises heaven, it turns out the other way around. So the issue of the military is really the hope that that change may be brought about. But as you've already touched on, the military, yes, they can cause that change. Yes, they can change the leadership. But whether they can occasion the necessary developmental changes is another thing. Because the military, as it is, they have their own abilities, but also they have their own limitations. I mean, in terms of Westphalian state models, which our countries are, is to ensure that the military play a role of guaranteeing constitutional order and the territorial integrity of the country, and they're supposed to guarantee the security of the assets and the lives of the people. But if they're the ones now moving from being a watchman to now into the living room and the kitchen, the question is whether can they be as good as watching over the gates and the walls and be excellent professionals in the same way in catering and issues of front office management. That's the mother of all questions, because they are quite a specialized institution in terms of defense and security. but can they do the dynamical politics and all this? This is the matter that we've seen in the history that has not been able to be managed as well. Of course, we've seen some advantages of military regimes in many aspects, where they do away with the red tape bureaucracies and all this, but at the same time they become intolerant in terms of entertaining contradictions, arguments, and so on, and they end up limiting fundamental freedoms and so on. So I think the military have a crucial role. They may help as an agent or a vehicle of change of government, but they have to work deliberately and quickly
but they seem to be
towards
the ones
civilian
determining
rule.
how that government will change and to whom it will change to. That's a bigger question. And in that very same regard, even if they want to, the whole element of a vote changing the leader, it can change the leader, but it doesn't change the stance of the state and the handicapness of the state.
No. The hope here is that these military uprisings are helping to break the umbilical cord between, or bondage between, the former colonizers and themselves, including some of the things that our brother has just raised, which bonds these independent, so-called independent states to their former colonizers. And as such, I think once they break that, it gives them a fresh leaf of lease to be able to start on a fresh note, so that they have an independent and more practical sovereignty where they can start working as sovereign states. I think that's the hope that is among these communities. If the military also drift into the bondage that the political civilian leaders have had, that will be too disastrous, because then they will have done nothing. So we hope that these changes will be fundamental, and that these fundamental changes will be anchored into the social base of the communities in those countries, and that the civilian elites that will take over from there will be able to cash onto it and continue with that degree of independence. And if you remember recently in Russia, most of these African leaders who were there expressed serious concerns about the bondage they have and the yoke they are suffering over the neocolonial control of the Western powers. And this independence has to be really calculated beyond just the military takeovers. It should be policies and programs that will ensure that they anchor economic independence. And President Museveni has been very critical on this, of adding value to the production of the goods that they produce in their countries, so that we engage these countries in terms of trade of business, exchange of technologies, and not just depending on so-called aid, which aid is not actually aid. If you look at these West African countries, the Western powers are talking of threatening to cut off billions of dollars. But these billions of dollars that have been coming in and trickling in, how come Niger is this poor country? So what's the use of these billions of dollars? The trick is that they give that money, but to support their own institutions and interests in those countries. For example, they are funding those militaries who are carrying out operations there. Some of them, it's actually about training. They're just there for training purposes, and how to be able to study and be able to counter terrorism, and use that as a case for their own defense back home. Not that they're there to help with the Nigerians or the Malians or Burkinabes.
Okay.
They're not just there to help them. It is about themselves.
You're giving too much revelation that befits what people are seeing as hope. Yet you earlier had said that this coups are presenting hope. So it's a rock and a hard place that we are in here. Mr. Semanda, he talked about the yoke, and the yoke that continues to, be the marriage between the foreign masters and these countries. One, because of the presence of resources, some natural resources that these foreign masters actually have a hold on. And then you also get to look at the fact that unless there is a tear of the original agreements, this is going to be a recurrence forever for the African continent. Now, from what is being stated, that may not see the light of day. However, Mr. Mlongo talked about policies and programs. Is that, can it be a reality for especially the West African states that we are talking about this morning?
Well, let me first tell you how difficult it is for the French, for these countries that are colonies or former colonies of France, how difficult it is. France is the only colonial country that came up with something that was what you would call a successful assimilation policy, to the extent that now, today, even today, people who are in these countries in West Africa, Mali, Central African Republic, Ivory Coast, it is much easier for them compared to us when they want to move from their countries to go to France. Very, very much easier. And I will also tell you this very interesting part as I go. If you go to French universities, including at the level of doctorate, they have degrees that are specifically meant for Africans or for their former colonials. That a general in army, a big politician in a country will send a student in France, and you'll get a degree that is only recognized by only and only that university that has given it to you. If you get it from Paris, you take it to Nice or any other city, it will not be recognized, because they've given you this degree. They know you will go back, you'll have a lot of power, or you'll have influence. They don't want to annoy your father, who is very powerful. It is the only country that I know of the developed countries that till now does this, but very few people know about it. Of course, not all Africans that have gone to France get that kind of degree. That degree is reserved for the sons and daughters of the very powerful. And so you can imagine. And this explains why the very powerful people, once they go back, because, you know, I got a degree, I had failed, I couldn't get it. So they keep praising France in the long run. Look, you've asked how successful it will be. Remember, France, even in the agreement they had with these West African countries, was you cannot train your military with any other country. You must buy weapons from us. You must allow us to station our army and bases in your country. You cannot, to the extent that even a few months back, the equivalent of National Water and Sewerage Corporation of Uganda, the French one, was competing to be the one to serve water to people in Niger. So these countries are in a tight situation. But why I strongly believe that the occurrences of these coups will somehow help is France is coming to reality. They are coming to understand that people are waking up. They can think, and they see that they are not getting what they really deserve. Okay. So that means that eventually France is going to start listening to the governments that are there. Not that things are going to change overnight. It must take time, because this has been there since 1962.
Mr. Mlongo, does what Mr. Semanda says, is it put into consideration when you do have the African Union and ECOWAS in this stance trying to come in and mitigate in the national matters of these countries? And what is what's the place of these regional bodies and African continental, bodies in changing these things?
These regional bodies and continental ones like OAU, AU, ECOWAS, and other RECs were established by Africans for very good objectives. They were meant to help us gain and guarantee our independence. They also, like African Union, currently since 2000, is supposed to ensure that they help in developing and growing and nurturing governance systems that are good in the respective countries. If you remember, we had even these peer review mechanisms in which there is a scorecard as to how the governments are performing in terms of democracy and so on. But unfortunately, external influences come in. Definitely, the policy on coups is very clear about the African Union Commission, and even the ECOWAS. They do not accept coups, military coups, and they also are very sensitive about unconstitutional changes in governments. But can they walk the talk? That's the question. If you look at the African Union and ECOWAS response to Niger, there is clearly a strong shadow of external hand of Western powers. And that means that they were able to acknowledge the change in Chad when President Macron came in to applaud and support the succession of the son of Idris, so and he cannot accept the change, the military change in Chad, but he cannot.
They are equally also well equipped in, on paperwork, objectives. They're well equipped, but when it comes to translation and implementation of these the
challenges,
the challenges. Okay, that's a very interesting discovery. We do have Stephen Mbite, who is on ground.